we can talk about the other components of the brain besides the cerebral cortex and the cerebral white matter. So when I look at the transverse, or the not the transverse, the sagittal section through the mid-sagittal section through the brain, you can see that there are other structures here. So we're going to talk about these structures, and you need to be able to identify them. So the first structure here that I want to talk about is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum kind of can be confused with the cerebrum, but it's not. Sits underneath the occipital lobe. And so this has or is responsible for neuromuscular coordination. And specifically that which is unconscious. So like everything that has to happen in order to be able to ride a bike, or after you've learned how to play a musical instrument and you don't have to think about it anymore and your fingers just do what they need to do, that is the cerebellum. So if we look at the cerebellum, it is located right here. So it's underneath the cerebrum. That is the cerebellum right there. We also have the thalamus. And the thalamus is a relay station for sensory information coming from the spinal cord, or maybe even cranial nerve. So coming from the, we'll put PNS, peripheral nervous system, to the cerebral cortex. So when we look at the thalamus, it is located kind of in the middle of the brain. So let me erase these. This would be my thalamus right here. So sensory information coming up here, sometimes it's actually filtered out. So like 99%, actually often, 99% of the time, the sensory information doesn't actually make it to our consciousness. It would be crazy if we actually sensed all the sensory information coming up from the body. So that actually filters a lot of that sensory information out and only lets what we need, what is important to us in that moment, to come through. Now, underneath the thalamus, which is the largest part, is what is referred to as the hypothalamus. So it sits below the thalamus. So we have the hypothalamus. And this is a super important part of our brain. One reason is it connects to the pituitary gland. And the pituitary gland is a master control gland in our body, an endocrine gland, which produces abundant hormones and releases them to regulate homeostasis in our body. So that connection to the pituitary gland is really important because oftentimes the hypothalamus is what stimulates the pituitary gland to release its hormones into the body. The other thing that it does is it regulates things like body temperature, thirst, appetite. It's also supposed to be or proposed to be the place where we have like anger, like rage, like when we get really, really angry, that would be anger, and sexual function. So like erection, like being sexually stimulated, like getting sexually aroused would be a part of the hypothalamus. So these are all things that are unconscious, right? Regulation of body temperature and thirst and appetite, and even sexual arousal initially tends to be unconscious. We can become aroused to a stimulus and then only later become conscious of what we are being aroused by. So that is the function of the hypothalamus. There's other functions as well, but we'll keep it there. Okay, so we also have the medulla, and the medulla sits next to the spinal cord. So the medulla functions, it is what is referred to as the autonomic reflex center. So this controls things like heart rate, like breathing rate. This includes things like blood pressure. So those are all unconscious. They're done by the autonomic nervous system, and so it's reflexive. So if we need more oxygen, our heart reflexively beats faster and we tend to breathe more quickly, right? So it's autonomic reflex center. So let's look at the medulla, which is right down here. This is connecting to the spinal cord, and between the, we're not going to talk about the midbrain, but between the hypothalamus and the medulla is another structure which is called the pons. And this is that structure that is enlarged right here. So we have the pons. So this is a relay station for action potentials traveling between the brain and the spinal cord. So this is really important to note that this is mainly white matter and it consists of tracts. So tracts are bundles of myelinated neurons in the central nervous system. In the CNS, the central nervous system. So that would be the pons right here. Now, likewise, we also have tracts right here, and this structure has not been labeled, but I'm sure it's labeled in another diagram. So this structure right here is also white matter, and it actually connects the two cerebral hemispheres. So the cerebral hemispheres connected, that is referred to as the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum, I'll write that one right here. So this is the corpus callosum right there, and this is white matter, and it connects the two cerebral hemispheres. Now, something interesting about this in particular is that there are some instances where doctors might go in and they might cut the connection. So they might actually go in and cut this connection and people can survive, which is amazing. But why would they want to do that? One possible reason they might want to do that is if somebody has epilepsy that is so bad that it might start in one area and travel to across that corpus callosum and cause a problem in the other side. And so epilepsy is just this electrical storm of action potentials that occur for no reason. And it can lead to people to have very, very bad seizures over time. And so sometimes when people have that, they go in and they sever that connection, and then the seizures are not as bad. And so that would be, it's kind of interesting that we can survive without that connection between the two hemispheres. The other thing you might want to note in this diagram is that this is actually a ventricle. That is a fluid-filled space that is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. This cerebrospinal fluid also travels down here and into the central canal of the spinal cord. We can also see here's our pituitary gland right here, and this is a nerve. That is going to be our optic nerve. So that is a cranial nerve that goes and innervates the eyeball. So these are the other structures besides the cerebrum in the anatomy of the brain.